Hello everyone and welcome to the next review. This is The Baron in the Trees by Italo Calvino. As always, starting with the back of the book. From the age of 12, the Baron Cosimo Piovasco di Rondo makes his home among ash, elm, magnolia, plum and almond, living up in the trees. He walks through paths made from the twisted branches of olives, makes his bed in a holly oak, bathes in a fountain constructed from poplar bark. An aerial library holds the books of which he educates himself in philosophy and mathematics. Suspended among the leaves, the Baron adventures with bandits and pirates, conducts a passionate love affair, and watches the age of enlightenment pass beneath him. This is a playful, romantic fable by one of the 20th century's master storytellers. I was always aware of Italo Calvino, primarily from his book, If on a Winter's Night a Traveller. I've not read that work, I've read excerpts of it. And as far as I'm aware, Calvino shifted in his writing career from more playful, immersive, standard novels, and by standard I don't mean lesser or inferior, toward more avant-garde, experimental, even postmodern approaches to fiction. If on a Winter's Night a Traveller, I believe, is written in the second person, and it's really about the relationship between reader and writer. Whereas this novel it holds that kind of quality of literary enchantment. Not to mention Patrick Curry in every single video that I do nowadays, but in his book Enchantment, Wonder in Modern Life, he talks about the qualities of literary enchantment. That is the unashamed desire for storytelling, the sincerity of the writer, but from the perspective of the reader, just this want to be immersed in a story. And The Baron in the Trees very much has that quality of literary enchantment. It's a book about one man's life, essentially, as all these events unfold beneath him as he lives in the trees. And I love stories like this, these more philosophical novels that show different approaches to life. I'm thinking of novels like The Man Who Planted Trees by Jean Giono, and especially Hermann Hesse's novel Narcissus and Goldmund. I love books like this. It was the 15th of June in 1767 when Cosimo Piovasco di Rondo, my brother, sat among us for the last time. I remember as if it were today. We were in the dining room of our villa in Ombrosa, the windows framing the thick branches of the great holm oak in the park. It was midday, and our family, following the old custom, sat down to dinner at that hour. Even though among the nobility it was now the fashion, inspired by the late rising court of France, to dine in the middle of the afternoon. The wind was blowing in from the sea, I remember, and the leaves were stirring. Cosimo said, "I told you I don't want it, and I don't." And he pushed away the plate of snails. Never had such grave disobedience been seen. For those of you that have been watching my videos for some time now, you'll be aware that I'm a great lover of the works of Mervyn Peake, and Cosimo here has quite a few things in common with Titus Groan from the Gormenghast trilogy. Cosimo really wants to escape the strictures of life, all the customs that he must abide by. His father, the Baron Arminio, has pretensions to become a duke. His mother, whose name I'm forgetting, as a generalessa. She comes from a military background. She wants Cosimo to become a soldier. Cosimo and his younger brother, Biagio. The brothers are taught many lessons, of which they don't really see the significance. They're taught by the Abbé Fauchel de Fleur, the French Abbé Fauchel de Fleur. I believe that's how you pronounce the name. All these different customs and strictures that they must abide by, and Cosimo is really much more strong-headed than his younger brother Biagio, who's quite complacent. And Biagio is the narrator of this novel, who's really tells us about the long life of Cosimo. And the inciting incident of the novel is Cosimo's departure into the trees, and he decides to stay in this arboreal realm after he meets young girl Viola. So I won't really spoil this encounter, but essentially Cosimo is he wants to impress Viola, and this idea comes into his head when the two are playing. Viola essentially says to him that you can't come down from the trees. That is your realm, and they're just playing as kids, essentially. But over time, it becomes more willful. Cosimo has this kind of deep desire to live for himself and to be independent and to stay amongst the trees. And that's really that's the main theme of this novel. This striving for independence, but also the value of community. So whereas in his life in the nobility, Cosimo would be told to disregard and disdain, for example, the fruit thieves that constantly steal fruit from his estate. Cosimo lives with the fruit thieves for a while, and he begins to see things differently. He begins to see that their rustic way of life has something to it. Because of his vantage point amongst the trees, he really begins to see how much his life is kind of stifling him. And he begins to actually help different communities. He will help the charcoal burners in the woods. He will do little tasks for farmers. He will prune trees, for example. It's really a positive and affirming work in that it tells us that we must strive for independence, but also not fully detach from society. The book is fundamentally about distance, but also about connectivity. And on that point about connectivity as well, the book is very much based in the ideas of the Enlightenment. It's about the written word, especially. Cosimo becomes a lover of books, but only through distance. He did not really see the value of his studies when he was living with his family and being taught by the Abbé Fleur. But once he lives amongst the trees and sees how these different communities interact with one another, he begins to see the value of reading and ideas and how these can be applied to these different communities. And what I found particularly moving is one section where, and I will try to avoid spoilers here, but he meets a bandit. These two form a connection through the written word. And letters and stories really form a core part of this book. This is a novel of different worlds. This is a book fundamentally about nature versus civilization, about romantic ideals versus Enlightenment ideals. This sense of distance allows Cosimo to really see things from different angles, from both sides. And I found that particularly moving and significant. Although Cosimo is this rustic figure who's eking out kind of a almost primitive existence in the woods, he kills a wildcat in one episode and skins it, and he wears it on his head as a cap, a fur cap, and he builds rickety structures for himself in the woods. He hunts with his dachshund, Ottimo Massimo. I particularly love that section. He is almost kind of wild figure, but his learning from books really connects him with greater ideas. He reads the philosophers. He reads Voltaire and Diderot and people like this, and he gains a better understanding than he would have. He almost puts these ideas into practice more than he ever would if he had stayed at home. There's so much I'd love to go into about this book, but I'm trying to make my reviews shorter nowadays. But the desire to escape and to be independent in nature, the conflict between romanticism and enlightenment, it's such a wonderful book. I can only really recommend this book. In terms of negatives, though, I would say that the book becomes a little bit the narrative becomes too wandering after a while. Does tend to overstay its welcome, especially as all these events occur, historical events in particular, the coming of Napoleon and whatnot. I felt that the sections that occur near the end of the book didn't really grab my attention as much until the very end. And some critics I read actually did say something similar as well, but I think there's still value to be had from those later sections as well. Secondly, I will say that in a novel like this, a literary novel like this, I think Calvino tries to put in a bit too much of his own knowledge of other languages. There are entire sections written in French and Spanish and Russian that aren't translated. These are heavy dialogue heavy sections in other languages, which I didn't want to really take the time to translate each and every bit of dialogue. That would be unfeasible. Literary writers like Calvino do tend to kind of indulge in showing their own proficiency in other languages. I remember Vladimir Nabokov did this in his books as well. These are relatively small things. There's a lot to take in from this book. I've only really scratched the surface. It's a book about one man's life in the trees. So as you can imagine, many events occur, many ideas and shifts in thinking and whatnot. The Baron in the Trees, fantastic book. Until next time, everyone. Thanks for watching.